Look, we're 5 months into the year. This is only the third one of these I've got out so far. I know it's another prog rock band, but please just let me have this. Sometimes I just really want to talk about some noodly boys, you know? Is that so wrong? Welcome back to the Average Joe channel. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Porcupine Tree. If this band need an introduction to you, then they're kind of Pink Floyd but 90s. Does that help? Essentially, they started their life as a side project for frontman Steven Wilson, and after a few albums of solo work, he eventually built up an entire band, which went on to make many, many records, and even more compilations and EPs and live albums and Christ knows what else. I'm going to be covering as much of that as I feasibly can in this video, these records specifically, if you're curious. And while I'm familiar with most of the big records on here, there's a good handful of these that I've only listened to once or twice, and honestly a lot of the deep cuts I've never heard at all, so this is going to be quite interesting for me, if not anyone else. Anyway, the general conceit of these videos is I listen to a record maybe 2 or 3 times if it's something I'm not super familiar with, and then sit down, press record, and rattle off my opinions. Once I'm done, I'll place them on a tier list that looks a little bit like this, and hopefully by the end we've built up some sort of overview of what this discography can provide. As is always the case, I am just some dude in his room making a video. I don't pretend to be like the authority on music or anything. So feel free to challenge any of my opinions or misconceptions or straight up dumb fuck takes in the comments. But please go easy on me because I'm just a weirdo guy. Anyway, we've got a lot of ground to cover here, so let's get on with it, shall we? May the prog rock wankery commence. Right, where to begin with this one? On the Sunday of Life technically is the debut Porcupine Tree record, but it's also a compilation album of sorts. All the tracks on here are re-recorded versions of tracks that originally appeared on the 2 demos, Tarquin's Seaweed Farm and The Nostalgia Factory, both of which I was originally going to cover independently, but then I found out that all the tracks appear cleaned up on here or on a later release that we'll get to soon. So fuck it, ignore those, we start here. Regardless of that, at this point in the band's career, it was not a band. It was Steven Wilson. So he plays literally everything on this album. It all gets stitched together in post, and it's very impressive for that, it has to be said. The dude can clearly just play any instrument well and create some really evocative soundscapes out of it as well. The same can't really be said for his lyricism. Most of it is clearly influenced by like Syd Barrett era Pink Floyd, mostly just fantastical gibberish which varies from out and out cringe up to something that might vaguely in some roundabout way be trying to make a point. If you're willing to put that aside, however, there is some good stuff on here. There's also some bad stuff on here. Jupiter Island and Linton Samuel Dawson immediately jump out at me as just being kind of obnoxious, like dementedly chirpy, in-your-face nonsense that just throws every zany effect in Wilson's arsenal into one song to try and cover up the fact that there's just not really much to him. There's also no shortage of interludes on this thing, which vary from the gorgeous acoustic picking and dramatic electronic stings of Begonia Seduction scene through the moderately underwhelming sound collage of him, all the way down to the edgelord spoken word whisperings of Space Transmission. But what can I say, it's a double album. I've spoken before about how I think basically every double album ever released could have just been a considerably stronger single album if you boiled off the fat, and this is exactly the same. If I were to do that here, I'd probably keep these 8 tracks, and it would actually be a bit of a banger record. Radioactive Toy is like the first track on the record that even sounds like Porcupine Tree as we know them. I love the simple propulsive nature of its bass tone, the big thick church organ synths, the no frills to the point earworm of a guitar riff that fills in the role of chorus on this song, and the way Wilson's like distant, uninterested sort of monologue pairs up with this more passionate backing vocal on the "give me" moments. It does meander into a slightly long-winded ambient section at the end, but it's ultimately pretty harmless. Nine Cats has some of the worst lyricism on the album, don't get me wrong, it's very Alice in Wonderlandy, you know what I mean? But I love the chord progression on this thing. The guitar solo on the back half has no business being as good as it is, and it's perhaps the most emotionally invested Wilson sounds on the whole album. Footprints is a champion of the quiet loud dynamic, this tense little vaguely threatening acoustic guitar passage that hypnotically loops until the song can erupt into this chorus of huge reverb laden Beatles lyrics for some reason. Again, lyrics are not this album's strong point. The drums on the back half are really cool as well. I just think this is a really cool example of build and release done right in music. And The Swallows Dance Above the Sun is a cool example of Wilson looking to expand his repertoire a bit. This is clearly quite heavily influenced by like Massive Attack and the trip hop scene of the time, with this really like danceable robotic drum rhythm, really slinky bass line, and this like pulsing rhythmic vocal delivery. I like how Queen quotes Crowley emerges from the back end of this song with like a groovy as all hell bass rhythm and some absolutely insane guitar improv, before taking us through a couple of pleasant interlude tracks to what might be my favourite on the album, This Long Silence. This is some of the highest energy on the record, certainly if you exclude the obnoxious Linton Samuel Dawson. And while it's another bass-driven piece, I absolutely adore the interplay between the infectious guitar riff and the little dee-dee-dee-dee piano motif that like bridges the verses together. There's also an extended backmask guitar solo on here, and some gorgeous drumming on the bridge before the song eventually devolves into like a mess of synthetic electronic noises, which bring us nicely into It Will Rain for a Million Years, the closer, which is maybe a little over long at 10 minutes, but it's pretty fucking gorgeous throughout. There's barely any vocals on here at all for the most part. It's just a slow build, almost post-rocky sort of exercise in temperance, a single explosive bass drum being all the percussion that exists for like the first 4 minutes, although the drum rhythm that does eventually evolve from that is honestly one of the band's finest. The slick introduction of the bass and the synths and the rich flute passage, it's all very dreamlike and expansive, and that's before you even touch on the fact that this is essentially a 10-minute guitar solo, and for someone so early in their career, it's very, very impressive. This is like Gilmore tier shit. So yeah, if the record did look like this would be a high A, I would say. But my god, the trash that drags this record down makes it impossible for it to escape the C tier. I'm sorry.
Well, I never think of when I'm 20 or when I'm 21. I think of tomorrow. Or this minute. And hope there's tomorrow. Because I don't like what's going on in the world. I'm scared of that more than drugs.
Steven Wilson was a productive boy in the early 90s, and between On the Sunday of Life and 1993's full-length release Up the Downstair, he put out 2 quote-unquote singles, and I say that lightly because both of them are half an hour long. These 2 singles were eventually compiled onto a single release a few years later, but I'm reviewing that full release here for simplicity's sake. Phase 1 and 2 were on the first single, Phase 3 and 4 were on the second. The full thing is known as Voyage 34. So far so good. This release is very unlike anything else in Porcupine Tree's discography. Essentially over an hour of psychedelic freak-out music, hypnotic riffing, extended ambient passages, more vibes than tunes, you know. Essentially the whole thing is meant to accompany an LSD trip, and while I can neither confirm or deny that this album sounds amazing on LSD, what I can say is it's very spotty without it. Phase 1 is mostly dominated by what can only be described as straight up Pink Floyd plagiarism. It's very much the riff from Another Brick in the Wall extended for like 8 minutes, and I'm not over exaggerating here, this is note for note. The guitar tone, the tempo, the picking cadence, everything is literally lifted directly from that song. It's hard to not notice if you've ever heard that song in your life. And while it's neat for a couple of minutes, extended for this duration is not really doing it any favours. The back half of Phase 1 does pick up somewhat with a pretty rad guitar solo, but frankly this band's discography is swamped with those, so you're not really missing a great deal if you skip this one. Phase 2 opens up with some really quite oppressive ambience, some spoken word samples, right, building on the LSD trip narrative in quite a heady, haunting way. And it concludes with a really quite cool jam session. These big shimmering chords paired with this really neat little bass riff, and of course another complimentary solo. Can't go far without one of those with this band. It's what's in between that gets me, because they just bring back that Pink Floyd riff again. It's one thing to rip it off, it's another thing entirely to make it like the central motif of your entire project. And since this track is like 17 minutes long with about 5 minutes of good material, I can't really recommend this one either. Phase 3 almost wins me over. This is more of an electronic piece, you know, owing more to the expansive, trippy, like chill-out dance beats of bands like The Orb than the conventional prog rock influence of Porcupine Tree's normal sound. It focuses primarily on this one really quite neat hypnotic synth riff, and is much more about texture and attention to detail than like being a psych rock jam session like the first 2 tracks. Quite like it for that. There's a lot going going on in the background, you know? Constantly evolving white noise, little snippets of vocal samples, half-heard guitars rising through the mix. Like, it's really not bad, and I quite like when the impetus really kicks in with this big banging like dance beat that comes in about halfway. My two major issues with this song are A, that it's basically 20 minutes long and has no business being. I'm all for the repetitive hypnotic nature of it, right? But it does outstay its welcome somewhat at that length. Maybe at 12-13 minutes I would have given it a thumbs up, but this is a bit too much. And also there's just this like rapid fire cymbal tap that's kind of too high in the mix and just a little bit shrill. Which again, I would let slide if it wasn't fairly incessant for 20 minutes, you know? I feel like this track's trying to give me tinnitus. Anyway, the record ends on phase 4, which is my favourite of the 4, but also the one that feels like it fits the least. This like tense, anxiety-inducing drone collage is right up my alley, but feels like it would be more comfortable on like Swans' soundtracks for the blind, or even Today Is the Day's Sadness Will Prevail, more than on a Porcupine Tree record. Even an instrumental spacey one like this really is a haunting piece, you know. Again, the vocal samples are clearly very carefully picked here. I imagine if I was listening to this on LSD, I would not be having a good time. That flute sample that they keep repeating in it, man, it's the sort of thing that kind of starts off annoying, but the more you listen to it, the more it like haunts you. The tortured guitar shrieks, the way any semblance of rhythm or melody sort of evaporates away towards the last few minutes, and you're just drowned in this sea of omnipresent synth noise. And the final vocal clip of "I'm just scared, you know, everybody is." Ooh, goosebumps. So yeah, definitely not a record without good ideas, for sure, but I'd be lying if I didn't say it overstayed its welcome, that it leans a little too heavily on its influences, and that perhaps not every idea Steven Wilson had was necessarily worth committing to tape. This thing's neither appealing enough for background music or really deep or compelling enough for something to just sit down and focus on, and frankly doesn't really measure up to other great releases in this style, even ones that Steven Wilson himself has put out with his other projects, so I think you gotta go top of D with this, but at least it doesn't have Linton Samuel Dawson on it. I'll say this for Up the Downstair. This feels like the first, cohesive, proper album in Porcupine Tree's discography. Sunday was a scrapbook and Voyage was an experiment. This feels like a series of competently made, interconnected but individual tracks. And I like some of those tracks. Not all of them, but some of them. It takes more than one cue from Voyage 34, leaning quite heavily into ambient sounds like sprawling space rock collages, slow building, almost post-rocky song structure. And that's not a bad thing at all. I think the tracks here, largely due to their shorter runtime, but also due to their willingness to evolve beyond their initial sounds, which is something that Voyage's tracks didn't do a great deal of, make them a more compelling, more progressive experience, right? I think where the album falls down is actually where it deviates from that formula, but we'll get to that. This thing has 10 tracks, 3 of which are short interludes which are barely worth remarking on, although it is quite entertaining to hear the voiceover narrator guy on opening track What You're Listening To talk about these musicians as if the band wasn't still just Steven Wilson himself at this point. I swear at some point this is going to become a full band, we're nearly there. As I say, of the remaining 7 tracks, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Effective opener Synesthesia does have a very cool little repeating keyboard melody that's a little bit lower in the mix than some of the more prominent elements like the overdriven guitars and the big high impact drum lines. And that's a trick I do like, but honestly the song itself doesn't really hold up a great deal for me. Take that one little motif away and it's honestly a fairly run-of-the-mill rock tune that doesn't really deliver enough hooks to keep my attention a great deal. Thankfully things improve a lot around the middle of the album. Always Never is a definite highlight here. Going back to the point I made earlier about these songs progressing, as in progressive rock. This one begins with a somber, hushed vocal performance and some crisp acoustic guitar and unfolds itself into a much bigger, more expansive tune, barreling through the stickiest chorus on the record before reaching this massive, lofty climax of bass and soaring electric guitar playing off one another in a double intertwining solo thing. It's a great jam of a tune, honestly. And then the title track flips the script a little bit, opening up with this spacious ambient piece, these synthetic chorus chants. which gently evolve into like a sweaty 90s club vibe of a dance tune, all pulsing drums and chirping synths and just this steady momentum building like layer cake of synths. Bringing in the like metal influenced guitar riffs halfway through is a really cool twist up on that as well. It's not what you're expecting, but it does fit the song well, right? It's not as dark as stuff on Voyage 34, but it is like generating the same sort of dense, heady atmosphere as those tracks, but in a much more condensed, like only 10-minute track. The record unfortunately starts to lose me again after this though. Not Beautiful Anymore is a mostly forgettable hard rock riff just repeated for like 3 minutes. Small Fish is a pleasant, like, early 70s Pink Floyd-ish tune that manages to fit a pretty neat guitar solo into its, like, less than 3-minute runtime. But it seems to mostly exist just to cue up Burning Sky, the 11-minute 9th track. And I'm not a huge fan of that one, honestly. It seems to exist mostly to be a technical showcase, the sort of thing that once upon a time I used to be a big fan of from bands like Dream Theater, but honestly these days kinda just wear on me a little bit. It's like, yeah, okay, I get it, you have technical guitar chops, well done, I guess. I don't know, considering how much effort this album seems to be putting into building an atmosphere and putting you in this like really dreamy headspace, tracks like Not Beautiful Anymore and Burning Sky really do kind of ruin that. I'm not saying this track isn't without its moments, like, again, Stephen Wilson is a very talented musician, very talented producer as well for that matter, but it's not really bringing anything to the table that you can't hear better in other moments of his career, and again, really does just feel like a bit of a flex. Thankfully the close of Fade Away brings things back. It's a sultry hum of a track, just sort of poised to explode at any minute, and I mean, again, the monster of a guitar solo he plays on the end of this track is a great example of his technical proficiency, but it feels more fitting, it matches the vibe of the album and the track much better than the math rock inspired noodling on Burning Sky. And frankly, as one of, 4 tracks on this record that actually feature vocals, I think it's his best performance on the record. He's by no means like a particularly strong singer, but he does a great job of providing exactly what this track needs at this point. So yeah, unfortunately, although the record does feel more consistent, more created as a cohesive whole instead of just sort of hammered together out of random ideas like his previous efforts, I'm still not like completely sold on this. It's a definite A for effort, but unfortunately another C as far as my personal enjoyment of it is concerned. So Yellow Hedgerow Dreamscape is essentially a compilation of the remaining tracks off the early demos that didn't make it onto On the Sunday of Life. And having listened to it a few times, there's a reason they didn't make it onto On the Sunday of Life. A lot of these tracks were clearly originally just like bridging ambient moments between 2 more substantial pieces of music, and most of the ones that weren't, not exactly of the highest quality, in all honesty. We'll give the record a quick play-by-play, and believe me, that won't take as long as you might expect. Open and Mute is one of the better cuts on here, an 8-minute instrumental jam with a pretty cool like central motif riff, which I do kind of like and enjoy the way it gets sort of gently reinterpreted throughout the runtime. It begins with some slightly off-putting vocal moaning though, and for some reason halfway through the track, the entire thing just gets muted a little bit in order to give the stage to a rambling spoken word monologue, and like it just completely interrupts the flow of the thing and doesn't really give it a great deal of opportunity to recover afterwards. You then have a needless run of 5 of those aforementioned bridging tracks. For the entire run between Landscare and Split Image, there is exactly one moment worth talking about, and that's a couple minutes into Daughters in Excess, when the gentle dramatic tension that track is building suddenly gets interrupted by this freight train of percussion, which is a really cool dramatic moment, which then unfortunately gets dragged out for about 4 minutes. Clearly Wilson didn't have a great deal of ideas for these tracks, he was just fucking about, which again is fine in a vacuum for a minute and a half between 2 more substantial tracks. Do what you want, mate, but when you back to back them like this, it's just kinda mind-numbing. No Reason to Live, No Reason to Die is the next track with any real meat on its bones, and it begins as one of those more sort of blissed out guitar solo-y tracks, kinda similar to the closers on both Sunday and Downstairs. It's very rough around the edges though. It does this kind of cool thing where the tempo just sort of very gradually increases throughout the track's runtime, and that sort of analog scaling is kind of a neat trick for like subtly building momentum. I don't know though, for a man as innately musically talented as Steven Wilson is, the drumming on this track just feels off to me. I don't know if it's meant to be like that, but it kind of feels like he's missing notes a lot as the tempo speeds up, and I don't know, the whole thing kind of reeks of first take. Waistcoat is a minute of my life I won't be getting back. Essentially just Steven Wilson tuning his guitar while stomping around on his little funny pedals. Towel's not too bad. Another 3-minute instrumentation with some pretty cool scattershot percussion, a neat bass tone and some fun guitar work. Again, it's very jammy, very like unfinished sounding. The mix in particular on this one is quite rough, and there are a few seconds of obnoxious pitch shifted vocals at the end of it that I could do without, but it's fine. Then we get to Execution of the Will of the Marquis de Sade, which honestly feels for the most part to be one of the more substantial tracks on here. It's clearly more thought out, the way it introduces the different instrumentation as the track builds upon itself and ramps up into a pretty impactful climax, but it almost feels like Steven Wilson was aware of the fact that this track is actually good and decided he was going to take a big old fucking dump on it, because twice throughout this thing's runtime he, again, much like on Mute, mutes it slightly and just slaps a extended sample of someone singing the Hokey Cokey over the top of it. Like the sample doesn't even line up with the beat of the song, it's just literally there to ruin it. Track 11 is another joke of a track, almost like Linton Samuel Dawson off Sunday, although somewhat less substantial, if that's possible. Stupid voice effects, no real meat to it, why is this here? Thankfully things improve for the final 4 tracks at long last. We have a sub 6-minute version of Radioactive Toy, which frankly I think improves over the original by cutting out some of the chaff, and I like the version on Sunday, don't get me wrong, so this one gets a definite thumbs up. An Empty Box is a fun jam, which I think must have been written for this release, as opposed to being an outtake from earlier, because it includes a sample that specifically makes reference to this being a box of early tracks, right? And the minute-long closer music for the head is not the same music for the head that appears on Sunday, but it is sort of like a suitable companion piece to it, a short, minimalist outro for the record. The real meat comes from the cross/the title track, which all included is a 20-minute tune. The cross I do like quite a bit. I think it could do with a little bit more time in the oven, a little bit more of a cleanup, but even though they don't really feel like they exactly fit together, I do like both the acoustic balladry of the main verses and the slick little guitar lick that plays against them. Plus, once the big distorted guitars come in and it just erupts into this monstrous, blissful outro, any flaws with the track's first few minutes are pretty quickly forgotten. The second tune in this track, Yellow Hedgerow Dreamscape, is frankly one of the best guitar solos in this man's career. Like most of what's on this record, it is purely instrumental and doesn't feel in any way lacking because of that. The immense faux orchestration provided by the synths and the constant build and release of the drums when compared with those huge all-encompassing guitars really do make for a fucking killer tune, man. My only problem with this is A, why the hell are these 2 songs stitched together? They could have been separate tracks. But also B, that there's like a 5-minute sort of bridging section in here. I don't know if this was actually live or like faux live. I assume the latter because, once again, this is still a one-man project. But the 2 actual tracks in here are conjoined by some kind of inane stage chatter by Steven Wilson, getting right up his own arse about how you want to vibe out to this music and join together as a spiritual entity with the rest of the crowd and all this, utter garbage. Cut that chunk out and split the 2 proper songs on here into separate tracks and you'd be onto something. Anyway, yeah, given that basically all the best tracks on here actually do appear on other releases, this is really just not worth your time. Unless you're like the world's biggest fan of the band and absolutely have to hear every single scrap of material they ever put out, then this should be a pretty easy pass. For me, this sits firmly at the bottom of D tier, and if I was feeling even remotely less charitable, it wouldn't have even got that high. Am I weird in thinking that Staircase Infinities is basically the best selection of tracks that Steven Wilson put out in the one-man incarnation of Porcupine Tree? Like, it's substantially better than the quote-unquote real album that it's paired with, Up the Downstair. I just feel like it's structured better, it sounds better, it has more impactful moments, stronger ideas. Like, Up the Downstair definitely had its moments, but this is like persistently good. Cloud Zero kicks us off by just ripping this funky ass jam out of this like sea of broiling static that opens the EP up. I'm normally a certified distortion lover, but this guitar tone is clean and crisp as hell, and I do actually really find myself loving the pure like slinkiness of it. And once again, it really does just feel crazy how much like a cohesive band this sounds. Considering it's constructed purely out of overdubs, the way the drums and bass play off each other on this track is like there's just 4 Steven Wilsons on stage, you know? Like that Spider-Man pointing at himself meme. The Joke's on You is the only track on here with vocals, the rest of it's purely instrumental, and I have to say it's probably the weakest. I still like it, don't get me wrong, it feels like a prototype version of what Porcupine Tree would go on to be, a much more sort of spacious, minimalist, tightly constructed pop prog song, kind of like what Pink Floyd were doing in the early 70s. And while it's certainly not as rich a tapestry as some of the real highlights off Stupid Dream or In Absentia, which are obviously yet to come, it does feel like a pretty substantial step in that direction as far as Steven Wilson's songwriting is concerned. What lets it down a lot for me though is that Wilson's voice just doesn't seem up to the song. He's singing in a really low register throughout the verses and he is struggling to hit those notes. And even in the chorus where he's in a more sort of comfortable space of his usual vocal range, he's still straining a little bit on this song. I don't know if it's some pretentious aesthetic choice that I'm not aware of, but he really should have just taken another take at this one. Navigator's perhaps the headiest moment of this EP. It is perhaps a little less sticky, a little less engaging than the other tracks on the record, but it definitely has some good ideas, right? The subtle organ in the back precurses what is yet to come on the EP. The steady sort of simplistic rhythm section on here feels very intentional in order to let the spacious measured guitar solo properly shine. It's a very nice piece that is just unfortunately outshadowed by the very best of this EP, which is the 2 closing tracks. Now track 5 is Yellow Hedgerow Dreamscape. I talked previously about how I enjoyed that song, and here having it decoupled from the cross and that annoying rambly interlude that's stapled onto it on the Yellow Hedgerow Dreamscape collection of tracks really does work wonders for it. You get to really feel the tension build throughout that absolute vibe of an intro, and when that guitar rips into the mix, it's a little bit cheesy admittedly, but my god does it work well here. So yeah, better recording and better mix of a song I already liked. Easy thumbs up here, but somehow that's not actually my favourite on the EP. Rainy Taxi is stellar, and not really quite like anything else in Porcupine Tree's discography, if I'm honest. Most of the heavy lifting on this track is done by the organ, initially to sort of formulate a somber, evocative soundscape, which just thrums through some subtle chord changes as these little cymbal patters tinkle away in the background, but it builds upon itself, it layers upon itself, and while it never rip-roars into high-octane action or anything, the musical miasma that's built out of the cleanly strummed acoustic guitars and precision point bass playing, which takes over rhythm duty and allows the organ to evolve into this absolutely gorgeous lead run. Fucking love this tune, man. On going back and re-exploring early Porcupine Tree for this video, this track has risen to be one of my favourite tracks in the entire discography. So yeah, this EP starts good and ends great. It's like an A tier, and I am shocked I am giving A tier to anything from this band's early work, but here we are. Genuinely a stellar listen, front to back. I spent far too much time trying to decide exactly which version of The Sky Moves Sideways to review. It seems to have a slightly different track listing basically everywhere it was released, and while I almost went with the American version, which breaks up the 2 Sky Moves Sideways phases into their disparate movements, I ultimately went for the remastered version, which kind of collates all of the material from the different versions into one release, although I did opt to leave off the alternate take of The Sky Moves Sideways on the basis that, quite frankly, this album already wastes enough of my time. That was harsh. I don't hate this album by any stretch, but it is quite easily the most self-indulgent thing in this band's entire career. And I'm including Voyage 34 in that as well, a record which obviously I didn't love, but at least seemed to be focused on a singular goal for the most part. A lot of what takes place on this record is virtuosic flexing, the sort of meandering guitar noodling that I would have been a real big fan of back when I was sort of 16, 17, but has been doing less and less for me as time's gone on. The most egregious example of this is Moon Loop, particularly the improvisation section, which I assume is improvised by the title. And you can kind of tell it has like an experimental jazz feel to it, I guess, where it builds itself around this like central bass motif. And there are some interesting ideas going on around it, don't get me wrong. I think the drumming's top notch for one thing. I should add that this is the first record that contains a full band, and having a percussionist other than Wilson on board does lead to some much more creative fills and percussion textures than we've heard in the past, where Steven Wilson predominantly, while a talented drummer, will see percussion as more of a means to an end, just a way of showcasing his guitar work more than anything else. So yeah, good drumming on this, but the utterly meandering guitar passages and synth experiments that sort of wind their way around it really does just lose me completely. I am clawed back slightly with the coda to Moonloop, which closes the record off, which is a more structured experience with a pretty fun, like, stompy riff to it, but honestly by this point in the record I'm mostly just checking my watch and waiting for it to end. Because the worst part is this isn't the only instance of this. Like, both Prepare Yourself, the 2-minute interlude, and The Sky Moves Sideways Phase 2 have some very cool guitar solos in them, right? The sort of thing that if they were built into a more structured track could have served as like a very powerful, very impactful climax to such a track. But when it's just back to back, man, it does just sort of grind you down a little bit. It very much does seem that the gloves were off now that Steven Wilson has his own backing band. Oh, I don't have to worry about constructing 18 layers of overdubs for this, so I can put all my effort into just noodling away on my guitar, which, good for him, you know? He's a very talented man, but I just don't think we need to hear all of it. The one sort of bright spark in the back half of this album for me is Stars Die. This, as well as The Moon Touches Your Shoulder earlier on the record, sounds like it could fit comfortably on Stupid Dream or Lightbulb Sun, one of the more sort of laid-back pop prog experiences that are to come up in this discography. And while it's more compact and less masturbatory than the other tracks on this record, I feel like it's had a deeper focus put into making it a really tight 5-minute experience, where the production values are just through the fucking roof. Again, I love the little skittering drum line that weaves its way through this thing, and the way that builds up into a series of like jackknife drum fills in the back half that really accentuate the sort of ramping intensity of the tune. I love the ebbing ocean wave of the vocal layers and the chorus, how they swell and fade over some really tightly constructed musical backing. It's a gorgeous tune. And yeah, I do really like The Moon Touches Your Shoulder as well, which ebbs out The Sky Moves Sideways Phase 1 by an inch to be my third favourite track on here, largely due to the simplicity of it, the stripped down nature, the very cool subtle little guitar lick, the doo-doo-doo-doo that repeats across the entire track. There's an awful lot with 4 notes, you know, gives the song this real sort of blissful pulse to it. And Dislocated Day track 2 goes fucking hard. This one seems very early in the discography for what it is, because it reminds me a lot of the more sort of metal inspiration that would creep into the band's later work, particularly In Absentia, Deadwing and Fear of a Blank Planet. Once again, top-notch percussion, some rapid-fire bongo work on here, which gives us like frantic, frenetic energy to the jagged bass line and the massive guitar riffs. It's on tracks like this that Steven Wilson's like disconnected vocal performances really do shine, I think. The way he disaffectedly sort of reads out the chorus, I will find a way to make you say the name of your forgiver. And then this huge guitar riff comes in, it's so cool. Absolute banger, it really is. And yeah, the opener, Sky Moves Sideways Phase 1. While I'm not a fan of tracks sort of being needlessly stitched together into one long piece like this thing is clearly just 4 disparate tunes just welded together, I think it's pretty consistently good. The opening and closing segments, The Colour of Air and Spiral Circus, are more sort of meditative guitar work, but this early on in the album I'm not as tired of it yet, and honestly they're shorter, more compact, more impactful as a result, and do a great job of building up and easing out the 2 middle sections quite nicely. I find that I'm Not Here is the only section in either of the Sky Moves Sideways phases that has any vocals, and this is easily like Stars Die tier, right? It's very space rocky, very contemplative, very focused on our position as a fleeting blip in the grand scale of the universe. And the big explosive choruses on this contrast really nicely with its much more subtle, more haunted verses. The remaining part of this track, Wire the Drum, is honestly like more dance focused, kind of like some of his earlier stuff, and particularly reminiscent to me, as someone who sort of worked backwards through this discography originally, of Idiot Prayer off the next record, Signify. I think Idiot Prayer will actually refine this concept and make it into a better tune eventually, but it's still very functional here, you know, really drilling that pounding bass drum into us and accentuating with these like skittering synths and a really neat hooky little bass line. It's fun and injects a lot of much needed energy into the otherwise quite sprawling nature of this piece. So yeah, I'm mixed on this one. When it's good, it's very, very good, and when it's bad, it's probably only bad in a way that doesn't appeal to me specifically. I think I'm probably going to sit it just below Sunday of Life in the C tier, because quite frankly, if it wasn't for Stars Die, there would be no reason for me to ever listen beyond track 3 of this thing, but it's dredged up from D tier by some truly stellar cuts. In many ways, Signify feels like an example of a band in a transitional period. Its sound kind of representing the dead centre between the more exploratory, self-indulgent, sprawling psychedelic prog of the early records and the more tight-knit, melodically focused and emotionally poignant music of the band's latter career. This probably has a lot to do with the other members of the band getting a bit more of an input here, perhaps pushing Steven Wilson away from 8-minute guitar solos and a little bit towards the tighter, more structured songwriting which he is very much capable of. There's still moments on here that remind me a lot of The Sky Moves Sideways, and not in a good way. Waiting Phase 2 and Intermediate Jesus are both very moon loopy, and you just heard what I had to say about that track, not my thing at all. And it's not like these tracks are without good ideas. Intermediate Jesus in particular has incredibly tight rhythm section work. I like the tinkling keys towards the end and the chopped up samples of the Hellfire and Brimstone preacher sermon. I just don't think either of these tracks could go missing from this album, and I would miss them very much. That said, the remaining 10 tracks are all either really quite integral pieces of the jigsaw that is Signify, or at least contributing to the aesthetics and the general flow of the record in some way. For example, I'm not particularly wowed by Signify, the title track, which feels to me like the band's take on King Crimson's Red a little bit, a much more metal-inspired instrumental tune that focuses around and evolves like a central core riff. Like, it's fine in and of itself, it's enjoyable, it's not like the most gripping thing on the record by any sense, but I think the reason it thrives and the reason it makes so much sense is because of the way it is so capably queued up by the little sound collage that is Born Live Die, the intro track. And as a result, it feels like more of a statement, more of a impactful album opening, hey we're here, pay attention moment, right? Similarly, at the other end of the record, Light Mass Prayers is like a sprawling ambient piece, predominantly dominated by these like ghostly synths and these like haunting layered vocals, which are actually performed by Chris Maitland, the drummer. This is a song he wrote entirely on his own. And while as a standalone piece of music, this is just pleasant background noise, I think it so very capably cues up Dark Matter, the incredible closer, that I wouldn't listen to this album without it, right? The remaining tracks are all pretty great in their own right. Sleep of No Dreaming never really stuck out to me, listening to this record years back, but now it's probably my favourite on here. I think just the cool like slickness of the interplay between the Hammond organ and the double bass give this a really strong framework to go off. And it's such a dark tune as well. I mean, obviously, the title is referring to death in and of itself, but the fact that the opening lyrics to this song and the entire album are, at the age of 16 I ran out of hope regarding the cosmos through a circle of rope. It's like, oh, I see what I'm getting myself into now. The chorus is huge as well, like this huge echo-drenched siren wail of the title lyric. It's a song that just does everything right. And as I say, thematically really gets us into the mindset of this like dystopian, techno-religious future hellscape that is honestly becoming increasingly more prophetic as years go by. I like Waiting Phase 1 a lot too. It's a nice point of contrast for the moments on previous records that I took particular umbrage with, because this track has a couple of its own quite wanky, shreddy guitar solos on it, but they are as payoff to the more sedate, more measured, and more pointed acoustics and pleasant vocal melodies. It builds to them and releases, which is something that Steven Wilson seems to be getting more and more of a grip on as a form of dynamic musical structure as the discography progresses. Sever is, in its own way, its own payoff to Waiting Phase 2, which, as I say, is quite meandering, quite unnecessary, as much as I love the use of the bongos or congas or whatever they are for the percussion. Because when we switch into track 7, we're almost immediately greeted with this huge, like, blistering guitar chord, this sample of an incredibly fake sounding laugh, and then this like shuffling, lumbering bass riff which pairs so nicely with these like staccato vocal passages. The track is just a ball of tension, which actually releases by going the other way and like reeling everything back for this more serene chorus. It's a neat little sort of play on the normal dynamics of a song. Another track which I think is very cool, and I mentioned on the previous review, is Idiot Prayer. Much like that one passage on The Sky Moves Sideways, this is a predominantly dance beat driven tune, but it has so much more going on, so many layers to it. It manages to move seamlessly into like more ambient passages, and when it is pounding into you at full force, it really makes a point to feel as intense and overpowering as it can, with these like police siren synths and unforgiving pummeling bass and this robotic voice begging for help. Like, despite being so drastically different from the instrumental tracks I loved off Staircase Infinities, this might actually be my favourite instrumental in the band's career, just because of the ways it plays with tension, you know? Every Home Is Wired is massively fine. I think what loses me a little bit on this is that I know they do the same sort of thing better later with Glass Arm Shattering off Deadwing. We'll get to that eventually. Again, I love the dystopian lyricism of this thing, the really gorgeous vocal harmonies in the chorus. I just don't think for the most part it leaves as much of an impression as other tracks on this record, and I don't really get the switch up at the end that turns it into more of a groovy jam piece. Like, as a track it seems to completely forget what it was going for halfway through. Thankfully, as previously mentioned, Dark Matter is a great closer. Again, much more restrained, much more focused on substance over style. Don't get me wrong, Steven Wilson is eventually allowed to let rip with a guitar solo at the back of this song, and it is a good one. But most of this track's 8-minute runtime is focused on building up a soundscape that facilitates that, slowly winding the coil with these dense synths and clockwork rhythm section, and some more truly dark lyricism, like gun down a school or shoot up a car, the media circus will make you a star. Paints humanity in a really dark light, and that's the point. So yeah, thematically this is a dark record, and when it's on point with that, it delivers its message incredibly cuttingly well. It's not always quite to my taste, but it does always seem to be working towards a common goal, and its musical highlights are genuinely pretty fucking stellar. This to me is a high B tier, and a couple of cuts would have put it firmly in A. If you've been paying attention so far, you'll note that my opinions on the sort of companion piece releases have been a bit of a mixed bag. Yellow Hedgerow Dreamscape was kind of objectively the worst cuts than what ended up on the Sunday of Life, whereas Staircase Infinities, as far as I'm concerned, blows up the downstairs out the water. Insignificance is kind of neither of those things to Signify. I mean, it's definitely worse than the main album. There's a lot of very unnecessary alternate versions on here. Signify itself lacks the punch of the original, largely due to being introduced by the similarly hard riffing, throat singing led Hallo Gallo as opposed to the intriguing sound collage born Live Die. Although I will say this version of Signify does end in a more intriguing way with some like intruding synths and then some actual vocals that sort of surface from the mix at the very end. But the other alternate versions on here aren't quite so lucky. The 7-minute meandering version of Waiting Phase 1 is just nothing, with an objectively weaker vocal performance from Steven Wilson and a guitar solo that falls almost as flat. Sever Tomorrow is Sever with less teeth, going for a spacier sort of production sound and lacking the impact of the original track as a result. And Dark Origins is just an exercise in what if the pensive, deliberate, slow build intro of Dark Matter just didn't build to anything. It is cool to get an acoustic version of Nine Cats to close this thing off, because I did really like that tune originally on Sunday of Life, but I think this more stripped down, intimate version actually allows the chord progressions and vocal melodies to really shine. Like, this song was clearly meant for this sort of setting as opposed to the slightly more overproduced version that we heard on the debut album. And similarly, I really like Waker's Gun, particularly the first version of it on here, which is also a predominantly acoustic piece, although it does have these big sort of stinging harpsichord notes over the top. It's neat to hear some lyrics on here that will eventually go on to resurface on Pure Narcotic on the next album, and I think if any of these tracks actually deserve to have appeared on Signify, then it's probably this one. Smiling Not Smiling is super disjointed and ultimately pretty forgettable, kind of jarringly switches between some different, rather mundane track segments, although it does transition quite nicely into Waker's Gun 2, which is the weaker of the two Waker's Guns, but is clearly meant as more of a reprise of the original, given its shorter nature and its sort of degenerative, noisy drum devolution. Probably the worst thing on here is Neural Rust though, which takes the same sort of let's evolve a single riff concept that Signify does, but expands it over a far too long runtime, lacks any sort of urgency or direction whatsoever, and only momentarily intrigues me when a sort of funk-inspired B part takes over briefly, but even that massively outstays its welcome. Serious contender for worst track in their discography, honestly. So yeah, I'd suggest giving this one a miss unless you're an absolute diehard fan. Just listen to Signify instead. D tier. Zzz. I'll come back to this one. Okay, I'll be first to admit, a lot of the reason I was not able to sit down and truly focus on Metanoia is because frankly I just wanted to get to Stupid Dream. This is, to me, easily hands down one of the best records in this band's discography, and considering how kinda ropey a lot of the earlier material is, getting to listen to an old favourite like this has been a real breath of fresh air. It's a departure from their earlier sound in a lot of ways. Musically, it's like a logical next step from Signify. It leans further and further into the cleaner, richer, more accessible sound. Shorter songs, more hooks, less needless derailment. But lyrically it couldn't be more different from Signify. Whereas the previous album was like a detached look at society in general, this one is very, very personal. Definitely a concept album of sorts, and focusing primarily on like a series of heavy metaphors for unnamed protagonists, heavy social isolation, clear depression, and morbid obsession with death. Yet despite the inherently heavy and dark subject matter, this isn't like a Have a Nice Life record. This isn't even a Joy Division record. For the most part, this is quite a bright, bubbly sounding record. I guess that's where the stupidity of the dream comes in, yeah? Anyway, I'm going to blow a lot of smoke up this record's ass, so let's quickly talk about the stuff that I don't love. There's nothing I actively hate on here for sure, but Piano Lessons, while it has grown on me over the years, is a relatively uninteresting sort of bouncy rock banger. And while this is the track that the album gets its title from, and it has some nice vocal harmonies on the chorus, plus some pretty cool slinky slidey guitar work in the back, I don't think the track list would miss it particularly. Baby Dream in Cellophane's a nice enough tune with some quite clever subtleties to its production, but I'm not wowed about the vocal melodies and the verses. It's very much just another song that's just there, really. And Stranger by the Minute is a nice, like, single bait pop cut, but it's almost exclusively carried by that nasty-ass bass tone, and the I'm so quirky lyricism doesn't really hold up as well in our dangerously irony-poisoned society in which we currently live. The rest of this record is fucking stellar though. Even Less and Stop Swimming might be the single best pair of bookends in this entire discography. The absolutely gorgeous guitar lick that leads the record in is so fucking good, and I will never get tired of it. I love the heartbeat pulse of the rhythm section at the end of the track as it feeds us into what's to come. There's some gorgeously lush synths on here. The chorus is big and simple and just a great little earworm. And the verses set the tone for the entire album with their weird fascination with death, talking about a choir boy buried on the moor and a body washed up on the Norfolk beach. That latter line is actually the opening line of the record, which perfectly mirrors Stop Swimming. As the album comes full circle and quite poignantly features the lyric, I think it's time to stop swimming. Which in the context of a drowning man, yeah. As a closer, it's very understated, and it works so goddamn well. Just this like subtly schizophrenic drumming pattern, some spacious piano chords, and while the band does build up around that to a degree, it's mostly just left to resonate, to give the lyrics room to breathe and pack their appropriate punches, you know? But it's not like the album's emotional moments start and end with these starting and ending tracks. Pure Narcotic's like a perfect pop ditty as far as I'm concerned, and a prime example of the band sort of taking more inspiration from like the tighter, brighter sensibilities of the Beatles as opposed to the meandering Floydian space rock that they've focused on previously. This is another track that steadily builds throughout its runtime, but does so very subtly and very functionally, increasing from just a simply strummed acoustic guitar up through layers of piano until eventually the full band's in there, but it always retains the simple melodic nature that kept the song good in the first place. It's also got some killer depression quotes in here. No amount of pointless days can make this go away. I'm sorry that I'm not like you. Like, I don't know what Steven Wilson was going through at the time of this record, but it can't have been anything good. Similarly, the 8.5-minute sprawl of Don't Hate Me, the album's centerpiece, comes absolutely crushing down on you, returning to those same sort of ideas from Pure Narcotic, but in a much heavier, more languid, more oppressive construct. Any brightness and cleanness is gone here. It's a grinding bass dirge and these big, like, pleading chorus vocals. Don't hate me, I'm not special like you. I'm tired and I'm so low. I'm not doing it justice, but like, this shit is heavy, man. And then just before the 6-minute jam that is Tinto Brass, a far better, in my opinion, example of the sort of prog rock riff dervish that the track Signify was trying to encapsulate. We have a Smart Kid, which is a track I never hear anyone bring up when talking about this band, but I think is very underrated. The sci-fi lyricism feels a little bit hammy at first until you think about it for a fucking second and realise that talking about the last person being alive on Earth is very much a metaphor. And the way the track spends its first half as like this beckoning distress signal of a tune before absolutely erupting into these guitars at the end with the calls of I will wait for you, like considering this is the last heartfelt plea before the self-destructive nature of Stop Swimming, the context of the album makes this track hit so much harder. And it's not all slow-paced melancholy either, to be fair. I mean, aside from Tinto Brass, we've also got This Is No Rehearsal on here, which is an absolute stampede of a drum track. The drumming on this album across the board is fucking stellar, and this track is like a showcase. This track is about as fun as this album gets, for sure. Incredibly catchy, I love the little funk breakdown in it, the big post-chorus riff. Absolutely great tune. But it gets robbed of a potential highlight spot by Slave Called Shiver, which has one of the most irresistible bass lines I've ever heard in my goddamn life in it. This and Hate Song off the next album are two of the first bass riffs I play every time I pick up my fucking bass guitar, man. It's so needlessly good. And it's not all this track's bringing to the table either, like, I love the big roboticized overdubs on the Mother I Need Her in the chorus, and the like clanging cacophonous synths right after that, as well as the subtle guitar needling that plays throughout the verses. Like, it's a sinister track, but it's also a fucking filthy one, and I love it for that. So yeah, listening through this again for the first time in a little while, part of me wanted to just give it an A and call it a day there, but honestly at its worst moments it's still a very solid record, and at its best moments it fucking blows me away every time. Stop Swimming changed my mind immediately. I've not heard that song in ages and it is so powerful. This record's ass, man. Lightbulb Sun was the first Porcupine Tree record that ever properly clicked with me, so it has a lot of nostalgia built around that, I guess. However, it's not a record I revisit much these days, to be honest with you. I feel like Stupid Dream, for the most part, carries more emotional heft, and there's more, like, engaging, progressive riffing and stuff on later albums. But revisiting it today really holds up. There's tracks I expected to love, of course. She's Moved On has sort of always been one of the tracks I recommend to people who want to get into the band. That immediate kick-started riff that's played on the bass is one of those riffs that's like so obvious you can't believe no one's played it before, but is definitely entirely its own. And it's a rare occurrence of the bass line essentially mimicking the vocal melody without it feeling like lazy, because they both contribute very different aesthetics to the song, right? I love the deeply layered harmonic chorus, I love the noisy distorted vocals on the second verse, and frankly the guitar solo that dominates the second half of this song is so fucking good. Like, it's not like ultra technical or anything, but it's one of those guitar solos that manages to go on a long time without ever getting boring because it constantly twists and turns and surprises you, and it just sounds great as well aesthetically, you know, great use of effects. Anyway, Hate Song is another song I've always very much adored. I mentioned that on the previous review. It's got such a killer bass line. I love all the creative little fills that go between each iteration of it. And for an 8-minute song, it really does fly by. They managed to build upon the core premises of it really well without ever straying too much from that central motif. And I love the subtle, like, overhanging dread of the whole song. This album, as far as I can tell, is a breakup record, and while a lot of the tracks lean more on the sort of melancholy side of that, Hate Song is very much one that is an outpouring of anger and resentment, and it's a track that sets the tone for that so nicely without even having to include its lyrics. I fully expected to include Rush on Ice as one of my highlights as well. The first half of that song is fucking incredible, man. So spacious, so haunting. As heavy lyrically as anything on the previous album. Can't stop myself drinking, can't stop being me. You say I deserve this, you think that I'm stupid. It's very, very personal. But structurally, the way it builds around this simple central main riff, this da-dum, dum, dum, and just steadily starts to integrate like these string passages, the lead guitar work, the drum fills. Like, it's very much a song that sits in its misery but also manages to keep serving you up little bits and pieces to keep you intrigued. I don't, however, think it justifies its 13-minute runtime. I think the back half does get a bit schizophrenic and confused, which might be tonally on point, I guess, but going from like breaking the silence with this all-out metal guitar riff and then ending up at one point in something that sounds almost like Aphex Twin, like it's just kind of all over the place. I don't think it really needs to do that. So instead, my third highlight is actually Last Chance to Evacuate Planet Earth Before It's Recycled, which is honestly fucking gorgeous. It's also a song of two parts, but they're much better parts in my opinion. First half is this bright acoustic, like, look back over the relationship in question, before the second half is more of like a tight jam session, building up with these striking guitar notes that pierce through the ambience like sonar, and then bringing in flutes and a really cool bass line. There's a lot of really cool bass lines on this record, and overlaying it all with a sample of a speech from the Heaven's Gate cult. It's a song that goes places for sure. There's other cool stuff on this record as well though. Feel So Low is a great simple closer that just lays it all on the table. In case you weren't picking up on the imagery prior, it very much catalogues the end of the bad relationship and the mental state of the protagonist against this gloriously somber backdrop of intertwining musical elements. The Rest Will Flow has single written all over it, but I don't mean that in a bad way. Some huge surging strings on here, a really catchy chorus, like it's definitely one of the poppier things they've ever done, but I really enjoy it, and it's a real like nice note of optimism before the horrifying run that is Hate Song, Where We Would Be, Russia and Ice and Feel So Low. Yeah, Where We Will Be is pretty heavy as well, to be honest. It is quite like pleasantly nostalgic, wistful even. Again, quite heavy on the strings, but much more laid back and sorrowful than The Rest Will Flow. It's a nice tune, but does get a bit overshadowed by some of the big hitters on the back half of this record. And I like How Is Your Life Today as well, which is very simple, stripped down like piano waltz of a song. It's got a very sort of retro, old vinyl sort of sound to it, and I like the sort of mundanity of the lyrics painting the picture of someone newly embracing life as a singleton and not doing it very well. The two tracks I'm least wild about are probably the two most energetic, which I don't know what that says about me. Four Chords That Made a Million has all the right pieces, like I really like the sort of Indian inspired percussion, the sitar on it. The big lead riff's even pretty cool, but I don't know, it's clearly sending up like cheaply written throwaway pop songs, and it kind of is one. I guess that might be the point, but I don't think there's another song in their catalogue that repeats the chorus quite so much as this one does, you know. The opener and title track Lightbulb Sun isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it almost feels like Porcupine Tree by numbers. It's like a box ticking exercise. The spacey kind of corny vocals, the simple intro erupting into a much more dynamic tune, moments of nicely layered vocals, the big guitar riff that comes out of nowhere. It's all there, but it doesn't do anything particularly interesting. I don't know. I feel like I have no adequate reason for disliking this song. It just misses the mark somehow. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that that aforementioned big guitar riff is like straight up ripped from the EMF's Unbelievable. Once you hear it, you won't be able to unhear it, I'm telling you. But yeah, I might argue that this record is actually more consistent than Stupid Dream. There's nothing quite as forgettable on here as like Baby Dream in Cellophane, for example. But those highs just aren't quite as high for me, really. I still adore this album, but it's not making it into S tier. Very top of A. Upon compiling the list of records that I was going to listen to for this video, this record was probably the one I was most excited about. I'd never heard this before now. Recordings, the most originally titled record of all time, is a collection of outtakes from the Stupid Dream and Lightbulb Sun eras, and as you've just heard, I like those records a lot, so I figured anything else recorded at the same time is probably going to be of similar quality. Now, I don't think that's necessarily actually true across the board, but there is some stuff on here that is very, very good indeed. The opener by New Soul, for example, should have been on Stupid Dream in my books. That's an S tier record, and I could make cuts to fit this on here easily. It's a proper prog rock odyssey of a track. The intro and outro focusing around these really like crystalline, sparkling synths and this much more grounded double bass sound like playing against each other. And eventually the acoustic guitar comes in and we get these really mournful verses which just explode into these huge bombastic choruses. It's such a gorgeous tune, man. Definitely the highlight off here for sure. And while it's a bit of a jarring transition as far as album flow goes, the next track, Access Denied, is very, very good as well. This is like a bright, bouncy Britpop tune almost. The simple jabbing piano does kind of remind me of like the halfway point between How Was Your Life Today and Piano Lessons. But it's much more fun, much more wink wink nudge nudge, you know? Especially when you couple that with the like megaphone effect on the vocals. It really is just a lot of fun, and I really like the vocal melodies that see the track out as well. Really quite pretty stuff. Beyond these first two tracks, I do think it goes downhill a little bit though. There's 3 instrumentals on here. Closer, Oceans Have No Memory, which is like a beach vibe of a palette cleanser. It's pleasant enough, but doesn't really contribute much. Untitled, which has some good ideas. I like to see the double bass coming back again. I think this expanded instrumental palette does a lot for the band, and it does a good job of building up from like this spacious ambient piece into a slightly more jammy, like fusion style sort of thing. But it definitely overstays its welcome at 9 minutes. Like, it could have communicated those ideas in a much more shorter, more compact form, I think. Ambulance Chasing is easily the best of the 3 instrumentals though. The absolutely relentless, brutal, like tribal drumming throughout the first half really just sets the tone so nicely for this like more like metal inspired track. The sort of thing that the band will be going on to do a lot more going forward. Big riffs, like 6 shredding solos, but it fluctuates in tone a lot, like there's some more serene flute passages in here. The tempo sort of shifts up and down, like gradually and subtly. Bit of a thrill ride of a tune. It definitely breaks up a lot of the more like low-key serene pieces on here, such as Cure for Optimism, Disappear and Informaldehyde. 3 perfectly pleasant, but ultimately relatively forgettable tunes. Cure for Optimism again starts out very, very ambient. I do quite like it. It kind of reminds me of Light Mass Prayers off Signify, but the relatively humdrum guitar ballad that it builds into doesn't really do a great deal for me. And while Disappear and Informaldehyde are both more immediate, more accessible like pop rock tunes, both of them make use of ideas which the band will go on to evolve better in future, in my opinion. Disappear's big shimmering guitar chords, and specifically the chord progression in the chorus, reminds me an awful lot of The Sound of Muzak off the next record, while Informaldehyde's glistening arpeggios are only like a couple of notes off being the same ones they will use on Drown With Me, which is also not a cut that ever made a record, but is a considerably more fun song than this one. Finally, we have the 14-minute version of Even Less, which, I mean, it's even less. I love that song, right? So I do enjoy this. But the second half does feel incredibly tacked on. There's a very jarring transition where the original song ends and then it just sort of falls into this like ambient drum section, which eventually builds up into this big guitar riff and transitions back into the main hook from the original song again. And it turns out it's jarring for a reason, because this apparently was written as 2 songs. This second half that never saw the light of day was originally going to be the closer for Stupid Dream, and I think it would have made more sense in that context, but back to back with the original song in one big 14-minute epic, it doesn't really do it for me. It just kind of feels like unnecessary padding a lot of the time, right? Plus there's no way in hell this thing would ever have made a better closer than Stop Swimming, let's be real. So yeah, tonally and aesthetically this thing fits the bill from what I was looking for, as a collection of additional songs from what is potentially my favourite Porcupine Tree era, but I feel like most of these were left off for a reason. It's definitely a pleasant listen, but it's not measuring up to what it could have been. I think this sits comfortably at low B tier. Just try it again. This record just slides off my brain, man. Very rarely has anything left less of an impact than this record has on me. In absentia, I don't know, I don't think I've ever said this out loud. Either way, it's generally considered to be a fan favourite, right? And there's good reason for that. Definitely not my favourite, but it is largely kinda stacked, I have to admit. Unlike the previous 2 records, it doesn't seem to have a central theme, or at least if it does, it's not one strong enough for me to pick up. And instead is just like a collection of 12 pretty solid tunes. And this does lead it to feel disjointed. There's flow issues with this album, for sure. But I have to admit, when it's on, it's kind of on. This album sees the band lean much more into the sort of metal sound that they've been experimenting with a little bit in the past. The opener Blackest Eyes is a pretty good example of this, almost immediately hitting you out the gates with this huge fucking riff. It's bombastic, it's heavy, but it's also like still quite progressive in the fact that it relies quite heavily on syncopation. The varied length pauses between some of the notes is very attention grabbing, which is exactly what you want from a leading song. I like some of the things it tries as well. The chorus is super fun with its like rapid fire vocals. I got wiring loose inside my head, I got books that I never ever read. And I really like the iteration where they cut out everything else and just play that against a few organ chords. Like, for what is only a 4-minute song, it does ride the dynamic train quite a bit. And speaking of trains, we're on to track 2, which is a complete tonal shift into what is potentially one of the best songs this band ever wrote. Trains is a song that does a lot with very little. Like, the majority of this song is literally just switching back and forth between 2 chords, carried entirely by the crisp acoustic sound and the really distinctive strumming pattern. It does the Elton John Tiny Dancer thing of making you wait for the chorus. It sounds great for like a solid 2-3 minutes before it actually slams that thing into you, and my god is it a great little vocal melody. There's a fun little banjo section in the middle. I like how they finally bring in the electrics towards the end to really sort of up the ante as everything comes together at the climax. Genuinely a pretty perfect song if you ask me. In comparison, Lips of Ashes is very understated, not exactly a track to immediately win you over, but I do feel like it's a bit of a slow burner. Much more atmospheric, much more ponderous and spacey. As is often the case with this band's work, there's some really cool overdub work on here, some beautiful vocal harmonies as a result. It's a long way from the strongest track on the album, but I do enjoy it for what it is. And then track 4, The Sound of Muzak, is one that's actually grown on me recently. I think it's a much better implementation of the ideas found on 4 Chords That Made a Million off Light Bulb Sun. It's the same sort of boomer take, you know, modern pop music bad, but musically it does more to justify the sort of lofty position that it's putting itself in. I love the intricate, jazzy little like classical guitar riff that facilitates the main verse and the really tight drum pattern that accompanies that. I do think the snare is a little bit over loud and a little bit piercing in the mix, but we'll forgive it because my god, the chorus is great on this one too. I have to say this album has probably got the most hooks on it out of any of their releases, so definitely a good starting point if you want to get into the band. The record starts to lose me a little bit after this. Gravity Eyelids is a great like 3.5-4 minute trip hop track that is inexplicably 8 minutes long. I love the other end of a telephone line drums and the stark piano notes over the chorus, and then the like dub influenced bass line that comes in on the second verse, but after that the song just sort of needlessly fucks about, brings in another more metallic riff, which it's not terrible in a vacuum, but it just doesn't really belong in this song. It mostly just serves to waste our time until it gets a chance to repeat the chorus some more at the end. Like, cut this song in half and it would have been great. Ditto Wedding Nails, honestly, although maybe cut it in thirds is more appropriate in that case. It's a 6.5 minute technical riff fest, and while it does showcase some cool ideas in the first couple of minutes, it then again just kind of drags that out. They clearly didn't really know where to go with it, what they actually wanted to do with it to build this into a proper song, so instead it comes off just kind of bloated and repetitive. And it's a shame because if they really did feel the need to put in a 6-minute instrumental metal tune in the middle of this record, then they still haven't technically used ambulance chasing on a main record, so why write an inferior version? Despite being a fan of this record for 20 years, I can never remember how Prodigal even goes until I listen to it. It's not to say it's bad, it's just very much there. For future reference, Joe, it's the one with the quite impressive high note in the chorus and the overemphasis on slide guitar. I do like the way it cuts off like kind of abruptly and leads directly into the bass line that brings in point 3 there. It makes that song feel like almost like a coda to Prodigal. And I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it feels like it is serving as like a reprise for a lot of the ideas on this record. The spacious synths in the first half of it sound very Lips of Ashes-y, and then the chord progression that comes in later is very Sound of Muzak-y. It's a nice compilation of ideas. I don't hate it. It doesn't necessarily do much to stand on its own feet, but aside from the fact that I feel this would be better served towards the end of the record than here somewhere in the middle, it's still a pretty good tune. The record really gets going again with the Greater Has a Master tape though, which is the sound of an anxiety attack. The staccato, sparse rhythm section, that bum 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 bass line, the myriad of absolutely sociopathic sound effects that are played over the top, the distorted vocals, the sudden violent explosions of guitar. This is a song that kind of hates you, and it's amazing for that. Definitely one of the better uses of the more metallic sound they're going for here on this record. And while the transition into the next track, Heart Attack and a Lay-By, is pretty stark and jarring, I think it kind of works well as counterpoint there. Heart Attack was a real contender for highlight here. It's the most blunt thing on the record by a country mile. a moving, like, minimalist piece that details what it says on the tin. The thoughts of a character who has pulled over to the side of the road and is dying in their car. The haunting, like, slow fade out of the repeated lyric, "She waits for me," is by far the most moving thing on this record, and it's just a shame it isn't put into more powerful context by the songs around it, because Strip the Soul brings back the heavy again, and I like this song, I do, but again, it's that transition. The track flow just does not feel right. Strip the Soul is the one longer track on here that actually justifies its length, if you ask me. Got a really groovy, like, slinky, sultry, bass-led verse to it, and then these great big noisy choruses. This is actually one of the few songs that repeats the chorus a lot and actually makes good use of that by constantly evolving how it presents that chorus. Initially it's this big, like, screeching metal-inspired thing, and then it manages to, like, unwind into this sudden jarring transition into this, like, almost like Spanish guitar version of it before building back up into this huge, like, doom metal sort of sounding drony coda version of it. Good stuff. The final track, Collapse Light into Earth, is not a track I have anything bad to say about per se. It does kind of feel like it's a bit rote at this point for the band to be finishing on this, like, pretty little maudlin palate cleanser thing. I don't think it succeeds in that anywhere near as well as Stop Swimming or Feel So Low, because both of those put a bow on their respective albums. They wrap up the concepts and themes nicely in a emotive little package, whereas this, it's very pretty, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't really do the same because, again, the theming isn't as strong on this record, and again, following immediately from Strip the Soul, it does not flow well. It's pleasant, there's nice strings on it, gorgeous piano work, but that's really all I can say for it. All in all though, good record. Some of the best cuts from this band's discography are on here for sure, and while the record does run a little over long, and once again I'll come back to it, doesn't quite flow right, I do very much appreciate the much more varied palette, the constant shift in ideas, the spontaneous flashes of technicality. It might play like a greatest hits, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know. This is A tier. If In Absentia brought metal into Porcupine Tree's work stylistically, then Deadwing did so spiritually. It's still got its fair share of heavier segments, but what helps to draw the through line between this band and, like, Opeth is the darkness of it, the intensity of it. This is an album you can drown in if you're not careful, and it starts slow at achieving that. The 10-minute title track is a good opener, don't get me wrong. I really like the ever-present sequencer pattern that skitters along underneath the rest of the track. I feel like it binds the disparate parts of this tune together quite nicely, from the more intense, like, hard rock riffing sections to the more blissful, like, psychedelic sections. Compared to what's to come on the album, I actually find this track to be relatively unremarkable, but taken purely on its own merits, I think it has a lot of cool ideas and it strings them together well. I think Lazarus is hands down the strongest track on this early leg of the record though. It sometimes lays it on a little bit thick, particularly with the slide guitar. I do always find that to be a little bit corny, but it really is a pretty piece of music despite that. That gorgeous little piano run that first kicks in the first chorus, the quite moving lyrics about accepting death, which are actually performed in quite an emotionally charged way, which is rare from Stephen Wilson. That bridge, that "My David, don't you worry, this cold world is not for you," is honestly one of the more affecting moments in this band's entire discography. I do like Halo as well. It's easy to overlook it amongst the other tracks on this record, but the rhythm section are working overtime on this track. I love some of the bass fills, the chorus is really catchy, and the r/atheism lyrics can be a little bit corny, but do actually fit the, like, oppressive, bottled rage nature of the song. I can't say the same for Shallow though. Honestly, this might be my least favourite track in this sort of golden era of Porcupine Tree. Don't know what it is. I do quite like the, like, dirty southern rock riff that leads the thing in, but it does seem to put an awful lot of stock into that one riff, and quite frankly the chorus just gets on my tits. So yeah, up to this point in the album you'll be forgiven for thinking I don't actually like it very much, that maybe I'd be looking to sit this in B or even C tier, but frankly the last 5 tracks on this album are pretty much all perfect, to the point where I almost wanted to pick all 5 of them as highlights. Arriving Somewhere But Not Here is the centrepiece of the album, quite literally. At 12 minutes is one of the longest tracks in their discography, and it absolutely justifies that length. It gives off such an energy of hopelessness for one thing, despite the increasing build of vocal layering throughout the repetition of the "arriving somewhere but not here. Vocal hook, and the fact that the song is steadily building, bringing in more and more instrumentation in each verse, it still manages to like suffocate you in despondency. And quite frankly, it has some of the finest guitar work across this entire discography, if you ask me. Not in like an ultra technical way, this isn't wedding nails, but like that simple glistening arpeggio that repeats throughout the track, the jangly picking that pairs with it on the outro, the absolutely heart-wrenching like banshee wail David Gilmour ass guitar solo after the first chorus, and the more subtle like jazzy one towards the conclusion of the song. Even the series of big metal riffs that form the bridge, which is the sort of thing that I've pointed to on tracks like Russia and Ice and Gravity Eyelids as being kind of unnecessary, but it feels far more organic, more built up, more nicely cued by the rest of the song structure than it does on those other tracks. This thing's hands down an essential in this discography. The Mellotron scratch is gorgeous as well. Great use of open chords and some really tight guitar picking to form this like relatively simple but really earwormy riff. It does a great job of consistently piling extra layers of vocal harmonies onto the chorus until you've got like 4 different melodies all intertwining with one another. It's a really cool effect. And then the abrupt change up on the back half isn't normally my sort of thing, but I think it really adds like a new level just as the song was sort of starting to run its course, bringing like a newfound intensity to the otherwise quite serene tune. And then just like doing it all again with the vocal harmonies, like a completely new set of perfectly intertwined vocals. It's so cool. Open Car is probably the most sort of blunt and straightforward track on the record, and I kind of love it for that. A simple like offbeat syncopated guitar riff and then vocals that like follow that. I love the way they're panned back and forth between the left and right channel so that it sounds like you're being circled by an angry prog rock vocalist. The chorus is massive, like huge power chords and massive echo drenched vocals. The sort of thing that would absolutely crush in a big arena setting, right? But it's the pre-chorus that does it for me. I just love those vocal melodies, man. That something broke inside my stomach, I feel the pieces lie just where they fell. Cannot hit that low note. The start of Something Beautiful is probably my favourite though if I had to pick. The creeping, sinister grooves of that bass line. It has a really distinctive tone to it as well. I don't think I've ever heard a bass sound quite like this before. It pairs so well with the venomous lyrics. Mother lost her looks for you, father never wanted you, you know. It's clearly supposed to be some sort of breakup song, particularly evidenced by the chorus, the "you thought it was the start of something beautiful, well think again." Which I have to say, another absolutely killer vocal hook. It's so big, it's such a gut punch of a chorus, just all these layers of distortion on both the guitars and the vocals. It's such a fucking avalanche compared with the like sleek, slithering verses. I just love the way the whole song fits together as well, like that bass line switches up to another equally awesome one towards the back, starts playing off these piano pieces, and then the guitar comes in and plays this like little noodly riff, which then like inserts itself into the chorus riff. Very well done. And then to contrast In Absentia, which again, I like that album, but Strip the Soul does not flow into Collapse Light into the Earth. Here, the start of Something Beautiful, massive chorus, eases itself out with like a subtle synth reprise of its main riff, which sets us up so nicely for like the opening white noise static of Glass Arm Shattering, which is a fucking gorgeous closer. It's one of those tracks that's like an exercise in technical simplicity. If you look at the last 3 closers, they've all done a very similar thing, a very like stripped down, no nonsense to the point tune, and this could very easily have been the same sort of thing. But they counteract that with just layers and layers of guitar and synths, and every one of them is adding something, right? There's always a little subtlety that you never picked up on last time, a little melody, a little deeply layered texture. The drums are worth pointing out on this song as well. I never really sat down and listened to them specifically before, but even though they never like overplay their hand and override the song, they always keep it simple, but there's so many subtle little fills and things in here that just keep the sound evolving. And then on top of all this, the song manages to one-up Mellotron scratch by just absolutely going hard on the vocal layers. This huge crescendo of like lyricless vocal noise playing off and drowning out and navigating their way through one another. It's really heady, really psychedelic, and really fucking cool. So yeah, the album starts a little bit patchy, but my god, it is like peak Porcupine Tree by the end. It's less consistent than Stupid Dream for sure, probably less consistent than Lightbulb Sun either for that matter, but regardless, I still feel like I have to put it in S. Probably the top of S, to be truthful. Minor detour real quick. This EP was technically released in 2023, but features 4 cuts, 2 of which are outtakes from In Absentia and 2 of which are outtakes from Deadwing, so it seemed relevant to talk about it here. And this was my first time listening to this, but I was already familiar with Drown With Me and Chloroform because they had previously been included as bonus tracks on In Absentia reissues, and I've always thought that Drown With Me should have just been on the main record. It's definitely the strongest track here of the 4. It's a fucking great, like, propulsive tune. Quite aggressively 4/4 for a prog rock band, but I do really like the main chord progression and especially how that gets reinforced by the big meaty dirty bass line that comes in after the first verse. The layered vocals on the chorus hit really hard as well, as they always do. Definitely one of Steven Wilson's stronger compositional tricks, but I like the more simple, honest, single-tracked vocals on the verses as well. It's just a tight little package, and as I say, the fact that Wedding Nails and Prodigal made it onto the record over this is a bit of a travesty in my books. Chloroform's massively fine, it's pleasant. It feels like it's over 7 minutes long just because that's what prog rock songs do. Like, I'd say it ran out of steam, but it doesn't really have much steam to begin with, to be honest. I think as ever the rhythm section are doing some work here. I really like how the toms sound, this gentle sort of pitter-pattering drum pattern throughout the thing. But ultimately this track doesn't bring much to the table that we don't see elsewhere in this band's discography, you know? The 2 Deadwing outtakes, meanwhile, are interesting because they're both instrumental. I think these are relics of the fact that the album was originally conceived to be a film soundtrack, which never surfaced. And Revenant definitely sounds like that. It's very ambient, a lot of futzing around with echo pedals and stuff, you know? Doesn't really do much for me, realistically, but it's fine for what it is, I suppose. Mother and Child Divided, however, is a bit more interesting. The Tool influence on this is quite noteworthy, I think. The odd time signatures, the big, chunky, like, off-kilter bass line, the really tight textured drums, like, this really does sound more like a bonus track to Lateralis than Deadwing. It's interesting seeing this band branch out a bit more, though, and taking on more outside influence, so I'm not complaining. Overall, it's a fine EP. Drown With Me really is the one cut that you should go out of your way to listen to on this, but I can't really fault the whole package too much. We'll go low B. I might as well get this out of the way at the start. I like Fear of a Blank Planet. I think it's good. I know it's a divisive record. I think most of the division comes from the lyrics, which I understand for sure. Like, the near constant modern cultural references date the album, like, painfully. Mentioning Gucci trainers and iPods, and quite possibly the most cringe of them all, the line "Xbox is a god to me." Like, I see it for sure. I do think when put in the context of the album's theming, they make a lot more sense, though. The record is about the mental health struggles of a teenager and the ways in which, like, modern materialism, social media, and society at large, like, only worsens the struggles that someone in that situation would go through. And as someone who was once an angsty teen with minor mental health issues, I kind of relate, to be honest. I think most of us probably do. I think this record reflects the sort of bipolar nature of its protagonist quite well, like, stylistically. By the way, it flicks back and forth between some of the most, like, intense metal-inspired music they've made and, honestly, some of the prettiest ballads they've ever written as well. The way My Ashes, like, gently picks out its chords against this, like, spacious, resonating backdrop of soft acoustic strumming and piano interjections, it's really, like, blissfully haunting and pairs with the lyrics really well, showing the protagonist, like, psychoanalyzing themselves, talking about accepting their parents' problems and feeling like rejected yet desperate for affirmation. It's a really sad little tune, and obviously the title hints at their own inclination towards suicide, which is sort of, spoilers, where this album ends up. Sentimental, though, is, I would argue, the prettiest thing this band have ever put to tape. I'm kind of reminded of Radiohead's Pyramid Song by the quirky time signatures of the main piano melody in this, but it really is stirring, like the way the notes like ebb and flow, like they're over the course of a bar played quite gently and then more impactfully before fading back out to gentle again. Like, it's a minor thing, but it adds so much more like dynamism and vibrancy to the song than it would have if it was all just very much the same across the board, right? And then the twinkling, intricate guitar that gets laid over the top of it really does just amplify the whole, like, floaty, depersonalized nature of the whole thing. Lines like, "I'm not really sure if the pills that I'm taking are helping," underline the nature of this tone pretty perfectly, I think. And my god, those vocal harmonies. I mean, this isn't the first and probably won't be the last Porcupine Tree song where I've raved about the vocal harmonies, but these choruses are so good because of them. The final part of Anesthetize is also carried hard by the intense vocal layering. This track is clearly just 3 tracks stitched together, which I'm not a fan of it when bands do that. Like, this could have been 3 separate pieces of music, really. But I've got to say, they're all pretty great, so I'm kind of unable to complain about that too much. My favourite of the 3 parts is definitely the first one. Great chord progression, absolutely immaculate drumming. Like, not just the intricacy and the feel of what's being played, but the way it's mixed and everything. It is an absolute joy to listen to. Another great chorus on this first part of this song as well. Plays counter to the verses, where they're talking about doing a good impression of themselves and how people just react with mock surprise to outbursts like the chorus. A few bars that sees the protagonist speak with absolute truth and honesty about how they feel like they're not really there and how they're sick of being told to shut up, be happy, stop whining. Really powerful stuff. And it marks the real turning point in the story of this record, I guess, where on the second part of Anesthetize, the protagonist starts to see people like zombies shuffling through the malls, you know. It's the most metal part of this album, for sure. Lots of big stomping riffs and like blast beats in the drumming and everything, and an intense like seething air to everything, while the protagonist talks about holding himself back from essentially shooting up a mall. I don't know, I know I'm talking more about the lyrics and the theming than the actual music here, but it all kind of goes hand in hand, right? Like, the music is always amplifying and exemplifying what the story is trying to say. Like on Way Out of Here, which honestly, I'll be honest, I don't like the chorus on this one. I think it's too big and comes out of nowhere and almost feels stitched into the rest of the song. But the verses are great, man. It's so very tense. Everything is like on a razor's edge of snapping. The tone's like almost conversational as he talks about not like being questioned about how things are going and how he's at the train tracks dreaming of escape. Like, again, the suicidal imagery is very strong at this point in the record. The second verse, where he clearly has like broken up with his girlfriend and is getting frustrated and angry about it, like, this is like a rare outpouring of emotion from this character. And in contrast to the first verse, it feels so like raw and like feverish, especially as that killer bass riff comes in to underpin the whole thing. The opener's great. I mean, this was actually the track that got me into the album for the most part. It's definitely the most accessible thing on here. A lot of catchy hooks, a lot of really overblown riffs and fun roller coaster dynamics as it goes from pounding your skull in to rolling it back to a more like psychedelic atmosphere. And once again, great melodies. That "how can I be sure I'm here? The pills that I've been taking confuse me" in the chorus is one of the stronger earworms on this record for sure. So my least favourite song on the record is actually probably Sleep Together, the closer, which honestly, it's fine, it doesn't make any major missteps, and I quite like the twist on the idea of a song about killing yourself, because like if you were to compare it to Stop Swimming, which is absolutely drowning in melancholia, this song instead reflects the like frustrations and rage of a teenage boy who just wants out, right? Like, the chorus is brutally simple and absolutely drowning in distortion, and I feel like that works for what the song is trying to convey, right? Particularly when you realise that he's trying to convince someone else to join him, which in the context of the breakup on the previous song, ex-girlfriend? I don't know. But yeah, while the song does deliver tonally for those reasons, I feel like the chorus just isn't as complex or as interesting as some of the others on here. The verses feel kind of stunted, and while I do like the heavily treated guitars that create this weird shifting ambience behind the verses, I just don't feel like this song is bringing as much to the table as perhaps the other 5 on here are. Sleep Together is perhaps indicative of the fact that some of these songs don't stand on their own merits that well, but as a cohesive album, they are a very solid whole, right? This is definitely A tier in my books, with Sentimental definitely being the standout track, I think, but theme alone unfortunately cannot lift a record into S tier. Particularly in comparison with a lot of their other outtake releases, Nil Recurring feels incredibly competent, almost more of a companion release to Fear of a Blank Planet than an actual collection of outtakes. I wouldn't have been disappointed to have heard any of these 4 tracks appear on the main release itself, which is a remarkably high bar considering how much I enjoy that release. And frankly, if you're a fan of this era of the band at all, then this is a must listen. The title track is an instrumental metal-inspired piece, and probably their best to match that description. It starts off as this like really tight, intricate, like King Crimson inspired, like math rocky thing. And it's one of those tracks that like builds to its climax within the first couple minutes and then somehow like shatters the glass ceiling of climax, you know? You're quickly feeling like you're listening to a high-speed car chase and thinking it can't really go anywhere from there, but it kind of does. Like the last, 45 seconds of this are kind of overwhelming, to say the least. Absolute cacophony of guitars and synthesizers, and if I'm having an off day I can find it to be a bit much, but most of the time it's a pretty hugely attention-grabbing introduction to this EP. Normal reprises a lot of ideas from the main album itself, and I guess that makes it feel like the most outtakey outtake on here. Most notably, the chorus is note for note the same chorus used in Sentimental, but whereas on that track it's more of like a psychedelic, heady dreamscape of a piece, here it's a lot cleaner, a lot more immediate, a lot more of a catchy sing-along hook as opposed to a mournful deluge of sound. But around this, the track is much more like constantly evolving and changing than basically anything off the main record. Starts with this really neat like acoustic, tightly woven picking pattern that's like quite unique in their discography, because usually they just use acoustics for simple chord progressions or occasionally more minimalist picking, whereas this is like borderline Spanish flamenco. It's great. But yeah, it gets more spacious and vocal led during the verses with these really prominent like rumbling bass notes underneath. Has some more like cataclysmic metal inspired riffing in it, and ultimately returns to the cleanly picked acoustics for what is like a second chorus, this one actually name dropping Sentimental and taking the track out to its closing notes. Cheating the Polygraph is probably my least favourite on the record, but that's kind of unfair because I really like the other 3. It does have some absolutely great like low-key insane virtuoso jazz drumming on it. Gavin Harrison once again proving he's the absolute goat. And I like the offbeat verse vocals that like play off that really well as well. I do think the explosions of heavier guitar work feel a little bit out of place here. I mean, this EP as a whole is very schizophrenic. It's bouncing all over the place a lot, but I think this is probably the most jarring case of that. But on the whole, it's definitely not a bad listen at all, and you could argue the scatterbrain nature of it actually plays into the theme pretty well. My favourite though is What Happens Now. One of my favourite moments in this band's entire discography is the end of the first verse, where the line, "Tell me with all your conviction what happens now," just opens the floodgates to the off-kilter, off-the-wall instrumentation. The already ear-catching, rattling percussion getting swamped in these juttering guitars and these spiraling synth effects, and then this big like distorted vocal that takes over for the second verse. And the song just sort of unravels from there really. It just keeps upping the ante, just keeps bringing in more and more like intensity and creative musical ideas and like drowning the song under its own weight. I love when the guitar solo devolves into this little like taunting run up and down the neck for a few bars, and then like everything kicks in and like follows that pattern, like the full band just absolutely smashing that musical motif into you, which eventually gets coupled with the wildest fucking effects-drenched guitar solo I've heard in a very long time. Absolute banger, man. So yeah, 3/4 of this EP is great, the other quarter is perfectly serviceable. I think we might have another A on our hands, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so my original plan for this record was just to do a stupid fucking little bit where I get to the outro and then I go, oh shit, I forgot Metanoia, F tier, and call it at that, right? But I feel like that's kind of against the spirit of what these videos are, and I felt like it was only fair to give it like a proper review. I'll tell you though, it's not going to be a particularly glowing one. I just find this record boring, I really do. It's essentially a collection of in-studio jam sessions that were recorded around the same time as Signify. And if Insignificance got all the tracks that quite rightfully didn't make it onto the record, then this got all the tracks that quite rightfully didn't make it onto Insignificance. It's just so monotonously samey front to back, right? Like I had my qualms with the sort of overinflated self-indulgence of Voyage 34, but that had a theme, it had a underlying atmospheric concept, right? It was quite intense at times. This isn't. It doesn't help that the bass tone is identical across every single one of these songs, so even though it's playing different notes, it just sounds very monotonous. And while there's some good technical chops on display here, the drumming is particularly good on Mesmer 1 and Insignificance. I really don't think this improvisational stuff is necessarily the band's strong point. They can do it, and I imagine it goes over quite well in like extended versions of existing structured tracks when they play them live, but without like a sort of core thesis on what they're doing, it vastly, rapidly just becomes pretty aimless. Wilson in particular, just noodling away on his guitar for like 10 minutes at a time and not providing anywhere near the sort of distinctive emotional depth that he can provide on pieces of actually written work like his 4-minute She's Moved On solo, for example. Possibly the worst offender of the sort of bloated monotony that this album provides is track 5, Metanoia 1/Intermediate Jesus, which takes the noteworthy bass riff from Intermediate Jesus and plays it for 14 minutes, nearly 2 times the length of the track that appeared on Signify, without any of the interesting orchestrational elements that expanded and expounded on the jam's core principles. No, all that's gone. This is just fuck-arsing around for 14 minutes. Like, if you need music to put you to sleep, then this is it. But if you want something that's actually engaging and entertaining, then maybe look elsewhere. Some of my favourite moments happen on Mesmer 3/Coma Divine, which opens up with a sound collage, has some really interesting like synth work going on, a lot of dynamic flourishes provided by those synths. Like, there does feel like there's more structure to this, and even though it is itself over 13 minutes long, which is still far too long in my book, it does at least mix things up enough, keep adding in little splashes and spices of fresh ideas that it's not quite as offensive as some of the other longer tracks on here. Mesmer 1 has a tight little like syncopated bass line that adds an inherently like off-kilter like stumbling nature to the entire proceedings, and then injects like a couple of extra accenting notes into that bass line around the halfway point, which suddenly flips the thing on its head and makes it sound almost like a jazz piece. It's a good idea, I just again don't think they expanded on the concept enough because, again, pretty certain this is all improvised, right? Just fun ideas that they milked for way too long. My favourite track then is Door to the River, which is a relatively short, by this album's metrics, like ambient piece, very heavy on the synths again, this like sea of blissful spaciousness not a million miles away from light mass prayers, has some nice subtle guitar intonation and some gentle drum soloing that gives the song a lot more of its own voice than some other ambient tracks might. I think it's pretty tight all considered, although I honestly admit the only reason I like this one so much is because it sounds quite a bit different from the other tracks. It actually has some identity of its own, right? Finally, I feel like I should mention Milan, the 2.5-minute closer, which is just a recording of the guys at a restaurant ordering food. I don't know if this was like a joke on their part, or if they genuinely thought they were being really artsy with it. I don't know, but why is it here? So yeah, I was initially thinking low D for this record. Thoroughly unimpressive and uninteresting for the most part, front to back. Harmless as background music, I guess, but nothing that I'd ever really want to get invested in. But honestly, with how boring and meandering a lot of these tracks are, I don't think it even deserves D. I think this one goes F.
When this freedom stains my coat with the winter in my throat.
I'm showing my age here, but I do actually remember when this one came out. There was quite a lot of hype in the build-up because it was announced that the record was going to be comprised of like a singular suite broken up into 14 separate tracks. And that sounded really ambitious and like next level, particularly after how the general opinion of the last few albums were that they were some of the best in the band's discography, right? Well, it came out and most people were underwhelmed and it quickly got forgotten. And I'm fairly certain the less than stellar reception for this record was a lot of what drove the band to eventually break up. But to a degree, I think that's kind of unfair. The Incident isn't a bad album. It's a long way from being my favourite either, but that's by the by. As previously mentioned, this thing is built out of a 14-part suite describing the incident in question. It's quite vague lyrically as to what the incident is, but there's a bit of a sort of Resident Evil 7 vibe about it. Tracks like Your Unpleasant Family and Time Flies, describing the weird aggression of the protagonist's partner's family, and then the run from there, falling into some sort of ritual sacrifice or something. It's a bit off the wall, but sure, I'm invested. The final 4 tracks, From Flicker to Remember Me Lover, are actually not part of this particular sequence, and I still don't really understand why they weren't released as a separate like partner EP a la Nil Recurring or Staircase Infinities or whatever, because they do feel a little bit tacked on, but we'll get to that. Of the 14 tracks in this central beast, several of them are either bridging tracks or shorter like snippet tracks, or in some cases just like a bigger track broken up into multiple pieces. I feel this is particularly true of Degree Zero of Liberty, Octane Twisted, The Seance, and Circle of Manias, with the same chorus being repeated in Octane Twisted and The Seance, and the bookending parts of this being kind of chug fests, the intro and outro, the sandwich tracks, right? This run, and this album in general for that matter, leans quite heavily on the more metal inspiration that they've been building up throughout their discography, and I do quite like some of the wilder moments on Circle of Manias, and the 5-minute Octane Twisted, which is sort of the central piece of this run, has a really nice progression to it. Starts with some call and response vocals and more subtly picked guitar before building up into the more intense metallic sections. It's a decent little run, which then concludes with I Drive the Hearse, which is the final track in the 14 track series, which is a really pretty closer for the whole thing, really. A mournful song of grief and moving on that doesn't quite fall into the like super minimalist trap that they quite often end up in on closing tracks. I really like the dense instrumental section after the first chorus. It's the sort of piece of music that you keep finding like interesting little nuggets in every time you re-listen to it. The vocals are mournful, there's a pretty cool like fairly simplistic but very poignant guitar solo at the end. Good stuff. Should have been the closer. Going back to the shorter tracks, there's things like the Yellow Windows of the Evening Train, which I think is really cool. Atmospheric little 2-minute soundscape using a collage of lo-fi singing and stuff. Like, I dig this quite a bit. As well as Kneel and Disconnect, which apparently is about Steven Wilson's own personal decision to quit his day job and take up music full time. It's just a really pretty little piano ballad, and is honestly something I relate to as someone who spent 10 years working a job he hated before quitting it and pursuing a more interesting career. But then on the flip side of the coin, there's also Occam's Razor and the aforementioned Degree Zero of Liberty, which really are just each 2 minutes of pointless chugging leading into the actual proper meat of the track, which is to follow. And unfortunately, Occam's Razor leads into the Blind House, which I also don't really like very much. The verses are a bit of a dirge, although they do get livened up starting the second one when they bring in these little sonar pings in the background. And I guess I don't hate the big riff, but it all sounds very nu metal-y, particularly when the big echo-drenched chorus comes in and everything. Like, I don't particularly remember my impressions of this record back then, but I feel like even in 2009 this was quite dated. Drawing a Line is another song that I feel like kind of ruins itself a little bit. I like the xylophone or marimba or whatever it is in the verses, and it really does build up like quite a soft, subtle atmosphere in those verses. But the absolute like flick of a switch into this big overblown chorus doesn't really work for me, largely because of the vocals. I think the intense repetition that is dragged out for far too long in these choruses is frankly bad enough, but I don't know, just something about the way Steven's singing here. It's very nasal, very whiny, very voice cracky almost. Like, I don't know if he was just having a bad day when he recorded this one or what, but compiled on everything else, it really does kind of ruin this song for me. I like The Incident a lot though, the title track. This one has very Nine Inch Nails energy, I'm not gonna lie. A lot of like pulsing, grimy synths and tense murmured vocal performances. It's a bit edgy, so if you're not in the mood for that, I can see this being off-putting, but I think they do a surprisingly good job of it considering this isn't the band's usual style. I love the big grinding, grating guitar riff that punctuates the first half of this track, and I also really like the way they managed to transition back into something that is more in their wheelhouse in the back half. The chants of "I want to be loved" really do like pierce through the like grimy noise of the beginning of the track and erupt into something much like bigger and bolder to finish the tune off. Not bad at all. One thing I don't like much on here is Time Flies, the 11-minute centerpiece. I do generally tend to enjoy the longer Porcupine Tree tracks like Anesthetize, Arriving Somewhere Not Here, Russia on Ice. These are all like examples of the band developing an idea over a long period of time, adding a lot of extra flair to it, spinning things out into some really quite impactful climaxes. Less so here though. And while this track does do a lot of things I quite like in the beginning, it kind of reminds me a lot of Trains with the super crispy clean guitars and ear-catching vocal melodies. I do feel like the Pink Floyd Sheep style descending riff that comes in at about 3.5 minutes kind of feels like an outro, and yet the tune just kind of keeps going after that without really having much direction. I don't know, feels like a tune with a lot of wasted potential to me. Anyway, yeah, as far as the 4 bonus tracks, I guess, are concerned, I don't think the record would have lost much for not having them, with the exception of Bonnie the Cat, which I fucking love. Definitely one of the weirder things in their discography, but to be fair, so's The Incident. I guess I'm just sort of leaning in that direction here. I love how sinister the whole thing sounds, right? The whisper tracks and the schizophrenic bass line, as well as that like main vocal hook of I know what will be, which every time it plays, it catches you off guard because sometimes it'll be like a quiet whisper, sometimes it'll be panned to the left, sometimes there'll be like 6 or 7 vocal layers built on it. Like it's never the same thing twice, which is kind of the sort of underlying statement of this track. It just keeps trying to catch you off guard, like with the microtonal guitar solo about halfway in, the sudden devolution into more metallic passages, the really quite vile lyrics about like forced birth and stuff, truly unhinged in the best way. The other 3 tracks though, as I say, I'm less wild about. Flicker's fine, fairly unremarkable. Black Dahlia clearly tried to liven up an otherwise fairly middle-of-the-road acoustic ballad with an obnoxious amount of vocal echo, to the point where it's just distracting from whatever else is going on. And while Remember Me Lover doesn't make any major missteps, if you remember when I was talking about the track Lightbulb Sun, I said it kind of sounded like Porcupine Tree by numbers. Yeah, this is like that to the extreme, you know? It's all quite predictable at this point, and feels like a very underwhelming closer after I Drive the Hearse ended the 14-track run so well. Yeah, outside of Bonnie, these 4 are really kind of dragging this record down a bit, I think. Overall though, I appreciate that the record flows very well. It incorporates a lot of new and experimental ideas, which hats off to the band for that. I never like to see long-running artists grow stale. And it does have some genuinely really ear-catching moments, right? So I definitely don't want to be too harsh on this, despite my distaste for quite a few parts of it. I think we can probably safely go low B on this. You know, back in 2022 when this record first came out, I actually included it in my top 30 records of the year list. I seem to remember being very excited about it, which is kind of fair, to be honest. Like, this is a band I love coming back after 13 years, and in a lot of cases that tends to result in fairly lackluster material, and I guess I was braced for this sucking, and to be fair to it, it doesn't. Notably, I haven't really listened to it much since 2022 though, which I think speaks volumes. Going back to it today, it feels a little bit unnecessary. Like, it's not bad, it's just like, I don't know, even The Incident, which I obviously liked less than the few albums running up to that point, still felt very much like Porcupine Tree, very distinct and intentional, and despite the more experimental and metal leanings of that record, it still had like an underpinning of the melancholic psychedelia that has kind of been their calling card since, Signify, I guess? This record, however, feels like an above average release from one of the many prog metal bands that have sprung up to imitate Porcupine Tree, right? It lacks the sort of attention to detail, the very specific calling cards that grant the band their unique identity. Take opener Harridan, for example. Like, this song starts out great with this absolutely raucous, fun as all hell, meaty ass bass line. Wastes absolutely no time getting into the album, right? It's delivering you the goods up front, and it's really fun. But this track's over 8 minutes long, and it brings basically nothing else to the table throughout that duration. Literally, the bass line and that one moment where Stephen Wilson goes, "Like the Harridan you are," it is it. That's the whole song, as far as I'm concerned. Very much like a first pass, like they were like, oh, we got this cool bass line, I guess that's good enough. I get similar vibes from both Herd Culling and the closer Chimera's Wreck as well, although both of these I do think are stronger songs. Herd Culling featuring some really neat, tight drum performances, a constant sort of shifting in its main riffs, and some of the stronger vocal performances I've seen across this band's entire discography. And Chimera's Wreck, takes the fairly original step for this band by closing on the big, overblown prog epic, which is normally placed somewhere in the middle of the album, and they close on something much more simple and poignant, right? And this is a track that is trying to say something, like the motif they keep returning to, I'm afraid to be happy and I couldn't care less if I were to die, obviously quite potent lyricism in and of itself. But there's something very dream theater-y about this song, I don't know. It's very focused on the guitar posturing, you know? The let's make a big, dramatic, technical prog behemoth which isn't this band's normal sound. You know, the long songs in this discography are usually like subtle, slow building things. Even Time Flies, which I criticised heavily off the previous album, feels much more intentional than this. I don't know. And all three of the tracks I've mentioned so far are just too long for their own good as well. It's weird how I haven't felt that about songs that are considerably longer earlier in their discography, you know? These 7-8 minute tunes overstay their welcome more than some 13-minute monsters have earlier. With one exception, the remaining songs on this record are shorter and better for it, I think. Of the New Day very much sounds like a Steven Wilson solo tune. I did briefly consider covering his solo work in this video, but my god, it would have just gone on forever in that case. But essentially, since the incident, he's put out several solo records of, in my opinion, varying quality. And one of his sort of major calling cards have been these like very built up, like quite dramatic ballads, of which Of the New Day is one of those, and it's not bad, honestly. It's got some nice chord progressions, there's a lot of density to it, a lot going on, you know, and the vocal melodies are great as well, so not a bad tune. Rat's Return is another more sort of technical metal-inspired thing. It kind of reminds me of what Wedding Nails could have been. If you remember, I wasn't a fan of that tune back off In Absentia, because it was an instrumental piece that just sort of mashed a few cool riffs together and fucked about with it. This song mashes a few cool riffs together and builds a song out of it, with some moodier verses playing off some more like high-octane choruses, and bringing in these like herky-jerky start-stop, time signature twisting guitar riffs just when the song requires them. Probably the strongest on this record, in my opinion. I do like Walk the Plank quite a bit as well though, which is definitely the most distinctive thing on here, I will say. This one's like a weird, warped synth soundscape, featuring some really like prominent melodic drum lines and a really hooky chorus with all these like layers of vocal harmonies on it. It took my ears a few listens to actually pick up on this one as being as detailed and intriguing as it is. It does sort of fade into the background a bit compared to some of the more bombastic tracks, but it's definitely the sort of thing I feel like the band should be leaning more into as opposed to the more sort of conventional quote-unquote prog noodling. Finally, Dignity is a track I like quite a bit. It reminds me a lot of the sort of thing they were doing back in the sort of Stupid Dream, Lightbulb Sun era. Very pretty, very fragile. A real like gorgeous verse, chorus, verse loop initially, which then builds up into something bigger and more sort of awe-inspiring. The instrumental bridge that kicks in at about 3 minutes with the really like spacey, twinkly synth line and the really twisty-turny chord progressions is an absolutely gorgeous change of pace for this tune. And then after some really quite impressive falsetto from Steven Wilson, this monster bass line comes in to underpin everything. The track sounded complete up until this point, but this really just makes like the bottom fall out of your stomach to hear it. Such an impactful moment. Much like the other longer tracks on here, I do feel like this track does overstay its welcome a little bit, like it could quite comfortably have transitioned from here to the big guitar-led climax at the end of the track, but it does sort of fall back to the verse again for a fairly unnecessary sort of minute and a half in the middle there, but for the most part this is a good song and quite comparable to some of the better stuff in their discography, honestly. Even if there is something in the back of my mind feeling like it's not quite as detailed or as lush as similar sounding songs that they'd done previously. I don't know, I guess this just boils down to change bad. Maybe I should be tackling this record with a bit more of an open mind, but something really does feel like it's just missing. It's entirely possible that something is longtime bassist Colin Edwin, who chose not to come back for this record, Wilson himself picking up bass duties instead. If not the man's bass lines themselves, but I don't know, maybe his contributions as far as song structure and arrangements are concerned. I don't pretend to know, but something just doesn't feel right here, you know? So yeah, this comeback album is not a record without its highlights. I definitely do enjoy some cuts off here, and there are a smattering of distinctive moments even in the weaker tracks, but I can't pretend I enjoy this even as much as I enjoyed The Incident. We're gonna have to go C tier with this one. Shit, well I've got to the point where I've basically done editing the video and just realised I haven't actually recorded an outro yet, so hi. Here it is. This video's ended up being absurdly long. It's nearly 2 hours, which is fucking crazy. So if you've made it this far, then thanks for sticking around. Good job. You win a prize, and that prize is watching me move nil recurring down to the top of B tier. Was that good for you? The only other change I'd consider making at this point in the video is bumping Metanoia up to the bottom of D, but on principle, the fact that it took me fucking weeks to actually form an opinion on that record, I don't think I can extend that olive branch just yet. Maybe one day I'll get over it. But yeah, this is my complete tier list. If you're a big fan of the band and have differing opinions, I'd love to hear them. Genuinely hearing different perspectives is always fucking great. Allows me to see songs in a new light that I didn't really appreciate before. It's happened before and it will happen again, so reach out, let's hear those takes. And if you're new to the band and want an entry point for getting into them, then can't really go wrong with In Absentia. That record kind of provides a little sample of everything across their entire discography. Alternatively, another great way of getting into this band is to follow the link in the description and check out the Spotify playlist I put together, containing most of the highlights I spoke about in this video. Not all the songs are available on Spotify, but I did my best, man. And also, highly recommend checking out their live material as well, because these guys put on a hell of a good live performance. Some of these songs sound better live than they do in the studio recordings, so definitely worth checking out, I think. Anyway, that about says it. If you have another artist you want me to ramble on about for fucking 2 hours, drop that in the comments. I'll be definitely sure to look into any musical suggestions you want to provide. And otherwise, it's been a blast. Thank you again for sticking with me through this fucking monstrosity, and I'll see you next time. Hopefully. Bye.